Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So Colorado does not have a law prohibiting municipalities from getting in the broadband business, but they do have one that makes it a lot more difficult. But that's not stopping a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities and towns from getting into the business. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So saw this story on the Denver Post. Broadband is booming in Colorado as voters lift limits on government's involvement. So again, while they do have a law, they don't have a law that prohibits municipalities from getting into the broadband business, but they do make it a little bit difficult. So just first, though, for a little kind of background here, this is something that is not allowed under the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program under the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO for BEAD. Because you can see here eligible entity obligations, and eligible entities under BEAD would be the states, like Colorado. It says here eligible entities may not exclude cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, public-private partnerships, private companies, public or private utilities, public utility districts, or local governments, potential providers from eligibility for grant funds. In determining whether to approve an eligible entity's initial or final proposal, NTIA will consider whether the state has, after the enactment of the Infrastructure Act, adopted new laws, regulations, policies, procedures, or any other form of rule or restriction that, in the determination of the NTIA, seeks to exclude or has the effect of excluding any potential providers from eligibility for its subgrant competition. This could include new laws that have the effect of excluding providers from offering broadband service or rendering them incapable of effectively competing for subgrants. Now, it's interesting that it says they'll be looking at new laws adopted, because actually there are quite a few states that have laws in place that do prohibit that. So I think that would also apply. And those states are going to have to look carefully at that as to whether they, how they treat those laws now that a lot of money is kind of on the line for broadband deployment. So again, one other thing I wanted to look at is what had been going on in Colorado. So you see here, Colorado state law allows municipal governments to offer broadband services to residents, but requires the city to hold a referendum before doing so. If there's no private companies offering broadband service, then municipalities may proceed without the referendum. So if there's any private company there, then they have to get a referendum from the people in that city or town as to whether they want to consider that the municipality would do broadband. 2017, this is interesting, the right of first refusal played out for a community near Ridgway, Colorado. The company aimed to provide fiber internet and won grant money from the state to complete the project. CenturyLink was able to take over the grant using the right of refusal and use state money to build out a DSL network instead of the fiber network. So I'm sure they were not happy about that in Colorado, especially near Ridgway. During the 2018 legislative session, Bill H. 1099 was introduced to impose conditions on the right of refusal. A bill was signed into law in April, and under the new rules, April of 2018, under the new rules, an incumbent provider must match the speed and price of the proposed network the new company is offering in order to take over the grant awards. That kind of protects from that situation where one company is going to be putting in fiber and then somebody like CenturyLink comes in and puts in DSL. Now, nobody would be putting in DSL today, but back in 2017, that's what they did. So, and you see here, to date, 140 municipalities across Colorado have opted out of state rules established that prevent municipalities to provide internet to residents. In November, Denver joined the list after 83.5% of the city's electorate voted in favor of preemption. A few cities have built their own networks thus far, including Longmont, Fort Collins, which approved plans to construct broadband network in 2018 and ultimately launched in 2019. So this is, I got this from, it's a good resource, Municipal Broadband 2022 on Broadband Now. And this kind of lists the states and what their restrictions are. So kind of back to the story, just looking at it real quickly. So you see here, subheadline, 4 more communities last month jettisoned a 2005 bill restricting that broadband development. So nearly 15 years after the first Colorado community opted out of a state law prohibiting local governments from providing or investing in broadband service, 121 cities and towns in the state have followed suit, including 4 more communities in November's election. The results of those ballots cast since Glenwood Springs first lifted the restriction on municipal broadband in the spring of 2008 is the installation of hundreds of miles of new fiber optic lines throughout the Centennial State. from Tiny Ray near the Kansas border to even smaller mountain village near Telluride, and dozens of communities in between. So, these are towns that are getting into the broadband business, and it could be that there is a provider there, most likely. If they're having to override this bill, then there's a provider there already. So it's most likely that the residents are not happy with the service, or maybe they just want choice, right? So there's a provider there already, and it's like, yeah, why not have a second choice to be able to do that? Then it's up to the municipality to decide if they want to follow through with that. They don't have to. Just because people vote to allow for that, that doesn't mean that the city has to do that. And something else about the BEAD program that you need to remember as well is that in some of these municipalities, cities, there could be a provider that's actually providing service above the broadband threshold. So they could be well above 25 by 3. And yet, if that's the case, then they cannot qualify for BEAD funds because that would be overbuilding an area. BEAD funds are really, certainly in this first round, they've said that, the chairman has said that she's not going to take off the table the fact that they might at some point use some of these funds maybe to overbuild to improve competition. But certainly what they've said is that all of the money that's used in the beginning needs to go to make sure that every unserved area becomes served. So in these areas, if they've already got broadband in these cities or towns, then BEAD funds are not supposed to be allocated to those. Those are supposed to be deployed to areas that don't have that. For Lakewood Mayor Adam Paul, internet connectivity is important as having water and electricity. We need to ensure we have robust systems in place to serve our residents and businesses. That's why Lakewood chose to team up with Google Fiber to bring gigabit service to the city of 156,000. So this doesn't mean that the city is going to do this on their own. Here you've got Google Fiber coming in. The company's first fiber to the home service in Colorado is scheduled to start going into the ground in the state's 5th largest city in the first quarter of 2023. For every city, it's a different calculation when it comes to bolstering connectivity. A few, like Longmont and Fort Collins, chose to build and own the fiber network themselves and are selling internet service to residents and businesses directly. Others, like Centennial and Colorado Springs, have built or are building a dark fiber backbone that they lease to third-party internet service providers, which turns around and markets plans to the public. So that would be an open access network. You were seeing a lot of that where the city builds the infrastructure, so they go out and they lay the fiber. They even will do a lot of times they'll do the customer installations and all of that, and then you just have private internet service providers that they could be providing service through their own infrastructure elsewhere, but they would come into the city on this open access network and deliver their kind of the retail end of the broadband services. Still others are taking a regional approach, like Region 10 on the Western Slope, a nonprofit organization that uses state matching funds to build and lease fiber in a remotely populated 6-county area of the state, stretching from Telluride to Delta and Gunnison to Lake City. So that sounds like kind of a middle mile kind of network. What else do we have? Different approaches here. So the effort to come out of the shadow of Senate Bill 152, a law passed by state legislators in 2005 and designed to keep municipal governments out of the online infrastructure space so as not to compete with the private sector, has been slow but steady. So in other words, slow but steady in getting these cities and towns to kind of override that. The bill includes a provision allowing communities to override the law. Aside from one defeat at the polls in Longmont in 2009, voters have given a green light to opt out of the state law 122 times over the last 14 years. On November 8th, Castle Pines, Lone Tree, Pueblo, and Trinidad became the latest Colorado municipalities to say no to SB 152. See here, Fort Collins was early out of the gate with 83% of voters there overturning the restrictive law 7 years ago. 2 years later, voters passed a $150 million bond measure to fund the city's broadband network, dubbed Connexon. Now, this would be that city working with Connexon. I'm assuming that would be the Connexon that tends to work with utilities, usually electric co-ops, but I doubt they'd be using the same name. I'm pretty sure that's spelled the same. So I'm assuming that would be the Connexon that builds that infrastructure for electric utilities. If not, maybe they name their service the same thing as that company. Construction on the 700-mile fiber backbone began in 2019. It's expected to wrap up in the next few weeks. Fort Collins is taking a full-service approach Maybe that is just their name. The city is building the fiber backbone as well as the fiber to each premise when those premises sign up, said Chad Krager, Connexon's executive director. We are operating the entire ISP. Yeah, it sounds like maybe that's their name. So they charge about $60 a month for 1 gig speed on both the download and upload side. That's what I pay here in Atlanta from AT&T. So I think, or is it 80? No, I think I pay 80. So a couple $20 more here. The pandemic has made high-speed internet much more important, especially high upload speeds, and we've seen that obviously. Pandemic resulted in a higher number of residents teleworking and students doing schoolwork from home. Thus, the overall need for bandwidth and upload speeds has increased, and high-speed internet has become a necessity. Also down here, I saw where got some rural broadband challenges. The Colorado Broadband Office, so this is where BEAD funds are going to come into play. The Colorado Broadband Office has long aimed to ensure that rural and underserved areas of the state aren't left out of the broadband revolution. According to a study published in June by Broadband Now, that same site I was looking at, nearly 675,000 people in Colorado lack access to internet service that can provide 25 by 3, the government's current definition of broadband. There may be as many as 80,000 and 90,000 rural Colorado households with subpar internet, state officials estimated. Lauren Francis, Broadband Marketing Communications Manager with the Governor's Office of Information Technology, said the state is preparing for a gush of dollars from last year's $1 trillion federal infrastructure bill, some of which is earmarked for internet expansion. So about $42.5 billion earmarked for the deployment of broadband, and Colorado is going to get a chunk of that. Our office is focusing on understanding broadband coverage across the state by building comprehensive maps to support future grant decisions when we're ready to deploy millions from the federal broadband programs over the next few years. So most states are in the process of doing that. They're kind of building maps, trying to figure out where they don't have broadband. They're not waiting on the FCC map, although the FCC map is going to be the definitive map that needs to be looked at. But they're trying to get in advance figuring out what that is. And they've got, all the states now have their planning funds, anywhere from a couple of $1 million to $5 million, or about $5 million, depending on how much they wanted to take. A maximum of $5 million on those planning funds for BEAD. So they're all putting that towards figuring out where they do need to have broadband. In early December, state officials unveiled a $171 million grant program from the federal government to connect 18,000 homes, businesses, and farms to high-speed internet. That represents about 15% of locations that currently lack high-speed internet in the state. And that was probably from ARPA, one of the ARPA funds that are available. Tribal communities mentions here also. Obviously, there are tribal programs in the infrastructure bill as well, could be used for BEAD as well. But so tribal communities too often find themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide. With this funding, the Southern Ute Indian tribe can bring their families, farms, businesses, and schools online, help communities within reservation boundaries improve their broadband service, and begin to close the digital gap. So a couple of comments here about overbuilding. So we're just trying to lower the barriers for internet service providers, he said, noting that laying fiber in remote, topographically challenging areas doesn't pencil out for most companies. And that's true. That's why we have the problem, is because most companies, private companies, when they're looking at these really rural areas, can't make a return on their investment because of the distance between customers when you're talking about laying the fiber and then trying to maintain that plant. So these funds have to go to these areas that really need that. Region 10 has acquired or installed about 600 miles of fiber optic cable in its 6-county footprint, lighting up more populated areas like, and then it's got these cities, Ouray, Montos, Delta, and Telluride with high-speed internet. But Brindell said there are still plenty of pockets in his part of the state where broadband doesn't exist, including some areas around Crested Butte where he lives. He says, we're not competing or overbuilding, we're just trying to build infrastructure where it hasn't been able to be built. Again, because of these economies of scale that don't really work on these areas where you've got very few customers and it's just hard to get the payback. But the big operators chime in. CenturyLink's parent company Lumen said the industry is best managed by private hands. The company announced last month the launch of its gigabit speed quantum fiber service in Metro Denver and Colorado Springs. Now, was that CenturyLink the one that built the DSL network and took over that? So it's not always in the best interest that the big companies come in and do this. Programs that favor government-owned networks have proven not to be in the best interest of consumers or taxpayers, she said. And that can be the case in some cases, and in other cases it's not the case. So it's each situation, depending on how well it's managed and done, it could be different. So certainly it's possible that that's not the best option. A lot of times I would favor private companies if they can do it reasonably, get a profit, and provide good service, but there are times where that's not possible. So over the last few years, internet usage increased. Our fiber-backed network continued to thrive as overall demand rose to historic levels, said Leslie Oliver, a company spokesman. So they are saying that they're doing well. Google Fiber in Lakewood will take several years to build out, but Mark Strama, director of expansion for Google, said the company is using a technique called micro-trenching. The width of the cut in the pavement is only about an inch or two to lay its fiber. Now, there have been some issues with micro-trenching, because normally you want to bury the fiber down pretty deep so that nothing can cause any disturbance to that. But micro-trenching, what they do is they don't go nearly, like they say here, just a few inches down, and then they cover it with that kind of epoxy kind of material. What's happened in some places is suddenly the fiber, for some reason, starts getting pushed up out of the ground and causes issues. So maybe they resolved that. Says we'll be in and out of your neighborhood in a day, so that much faster and much less expensive to do that micro trenching. So again, you can see here that despite Colorado again having some restrictive laws, the cities, towns there are voting to do broadband. It doesn't mean, again, if the residents say, yeah, we would like to do that, it doesn't mean that the city is definitely going to do that. Or it could mean that they're going to do a public-private partnership with another company, could do an open access network, those kinds of things. So it's great to have options. We want to make sure that, again, though, that all BEAD funds wind up going to those areas that are underserved and unserved first. So if you've got areas that are certainly less than 25 by 3 or even 100 by 20, then those are the areas that we want to be covering with this money, because we want to make that money go as far as possible, make sure that everybody has the good, high-quality broadband experience wherever they are. And that's the whole purpose of this. So, and certainly municipalities, electric co-ops, in addition to private, independent ISPs and big public ISPs, all should have a shot at doing that, just making sure that we spend that money wisely. Thanks for joining me for Broadband Deployment News. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and click the like button if you would. Click subscribe if you're not subscribed. Click the bell to be notified, and you'll be notified when I'm live. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.